Rapid Rehousing Core Components. Today's webinar is on rent and move-in assistance, and I'm Stuart Campbell. I want to just briefly go over the agenda. I will, once we complete the introductions and welcome, I will do a very brief overview of the core components of Rapid Rehousing, and then I'll turn it over to Chris Freed to cover financial assistance for families in Rapid Rehousing programs, followed by Robin Meyer covering financial assistance for youth in Rapid Rehousing programs, and then financing Rapid Rehousing using progressive engagement with Melanie Zamora. And then we'll have a Q&A. Just want to let you all know that the program part of this webinar will be relatively brief because we have a lot of folks on the webinar, and that typically generates a lot of questions. So we'd like to reserve the majority of the time to handle the questions and get your input and thoughts so that we can better tailor this webinar to your individual needs. Just want to introduce the presenters very briefly. Again, I'm Stuart Campbell. I'm the project director here at the National Alliance to End Homelessness in Washington, D.C. Chris Freed is Associate Vice President for Programs at the Los Angeles Family Housing. Robin Meyer is Program Manager at the Northwest Youth Services in Bellingham, Washington. And Melanie Zamora is Director of Housing Programs at the Road Home in Salt Lake City, Utah. During the webinar and the presentation, you can ask questions at any time. We will be holding the questions until the end because I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, and we want to make sure we just get through the brief presentations and then turn it over to the Q&A. But you can enter your question at any time. I also want to let you know that this webinar is going to be recorded and should be available on our website hopefully by the end of the day, and if not, it will be definitely there tomorrow. So let's start. I just want to give you all a brief overview of the core components. The core components were developed about a year ago in January of 2014. The purpose of the core components is to help organizations, funders, federal agencies, and others to distinguish a true rapid rehousing strategy from other strategies. And these core components really are designed to be the bare minimum of what is required for a program to be considered rapid rehousing. These core components have been endorsed by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, and of course, the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Just briefly, there are three core components. The first one is on housing identification. We did a webinar in December of last year on housing identification, and that includes landlord recruitment, addressing potential barriers, and assisting households to link to appropriate housing. The rent and move-in assistance is the topic of today's webinar, and it focuses largely on the financial aid portion of rapid rehousing. And the final core component is rapid rehousing case management and services, and that will be covered in our webinar in February. But just really quickly, I'll go over this fairly quickly. It's designed to help assist households who are experiencing homelessness, select among various housing options, assisting with barriers that impede access to housing, assist households negotiate manageable and appropriate lease agreements, monitor household stability, and assist in resolving crises, linking the household to resources, and then ensuring the services are client-driven, respectful, and voluntary. You can find the core components on our website. Here's the web address. It's a little bit long, so if you just want to go to our primary website, endhomelessness.org, and then go to the Rapid Rehousing page, you'll see the core components right in the front. Today's focus is on rent and move-in assistance, and I'd like to now turn it over to Chris Freed with the Los Angeles Family Housing. Chris? Chris, are you there? We cannot hear you at the moment. Looks like we might be having a little technical difficulty. I apologize for that. Chris, it looks like you are muted. So if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself for your presentation. There we go. Can you hear us? All right, well, it looks like we're having some technical difficulty with Chris Freed. So while we try and sort that out, let us turn to Robin Meyer, and I'm going to advance the slides. And again, I apologize for this. I'm going to advance the slides, and I would like to introduce Robin Meyer, who's going to do financial assistance for youth in rapid rehousing programs. Robin, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody. I am going to talk about rapid rehousing for youth and how we determine financial assistance and a little bit of information about how we came to do rapid rehousing with youth. Next slide. So I work for Northwest Youth Services, and we are an organization in Bellingham, Washington, and Whatcom County. Our mission is that we collaborate with at-risk, runaway, and homeless youth to foster self-reliance. We run a number of different programs. We have a transitional living program for 18 to 21-year-olds, and it is a scattered site-based program for both singles and pregnant and parenting young people. We also run a permanent housing program for 18 to 25-year-olds, and this is a rapid rehousing-based permanent housing program, as well as a youth shelter for minors called the PAD. We do mental health case management, as well as run a street outreach program. Next slide. We believe that the rapid rehousing approach really is in alignment with a number of the positive youth development core values, as well as our agency's core values. We believe that, that rapid rehousing really embraces the potential for change, the empowerment piece, the strengths-based approach, and the innovation. I think anytime you're working with youth, it requires innovation, and we really take the approach that if the youth says that they have a plan to be able to maintain housing and increase their income, that we are going to be their champion and believe that they're capable of doing that. Next slide. Our funding for rapid rehousing comes from a number of different sources. We have funding through the Emergency Solutions Grant, through the North Sound Mental Health Administration, rental assistance dollars, and through the Whatcom County Health Department. We've been doing rapid rehousing program for about the last 7 years. Kind of came out of necessity. We actually don't have any very limited permanent supportive housing, and so we really had to kind of piece together these rental assistance dollars to create the most permanent situation we could for youth, both that have very high barriers and need a high level of support, and youth that may be able to turn around pretty quickly into self-reliance. Next slide. So some of the details about how we do it. We use a step-down approach, which I'll give an example of in just a few slides, where the youth is asked to pay 30% of their income from the last 30 days towards the move-in costs. So that primarily goes towards the first month's rent. The rent assistance does help with the deposit as well. We ask for income documentation and then calculate what their portion of assistance is going to be. In the first couple of meetings, a plan is discussed with them on how they intend to either gain employment or increase their income. And we create an initial payment plan where it stair-steps the youth into paying the full rent amount in 3 to 6 months. Obviously, this is done collaboratively with the client and the case manager. We do a pre-case management program as well, so the case manager has had a chance prior to the youth being housed to get to know them and what their strengths and what their barriers may be. Some of the concrete tools that we use are a rent calculator, which was developed through a community partner in the coordinated entry system. We use an attendance log and job search tracking sheets, as well as doing budgeting and bank account documentation. So we really try to get as much concrete information from the youth as possible to make sure we're giving an appropriate amount of rental assistance. One of the unique things with youth is that we often request additional assistance if the original plan needs to be adapted. So if employment plans didn't work out the way the youth thought they might, or if the family composition or household size has changed, then we can adjust the assistance request kind of in real time. Next slide. So these are some examples, and I apologize that they look to be a little bit blurry, of how we calculate the rental assistance. On the left is our rent assistance calculator. So it looks at the household size and the number of the size of the unit, as well as the amount of income and the source of income, and then it calculates if they have children, it figures that into it, if there's out-of-pocket child care expenses, kind of going from top to bottom. And then it will calculate what 30% of their adjusted income would be, and some other factors. I'm just going to kind of skim through it. And at the bottom, number 11, it shows what the tenant payment would be. So this is the minimum amount that we would be asking them to contribute towards the move-in costs, as well as what the landlord's subsidy would be. So the subsidy we would be providing would be. And on the right is an example of our assistance request. So as you can see in the table there, it shows how the client contribution increases. This recently changed. We used to have one that had 6 months broken out, and now we do it by 3-month increments, knowing that most likely on that 3rd month we're going to need to do an additional assistance request and extend the subsidy a bit more if they have not been able to get up to being able to pay the full rent amount by the 3rd month. Next slide. Some of the details of our program: we don't ever guarantee funding to the landlord because our services are voluntary, and if a youth does not engage in case management, or we're not able to engage the youth in case management, or they're not paying their portion of their rent and we're not able to identify a way to overcome that barrier, we can end the program, which would mean the landlord would have to follow through on their legal proceedings. The financial assistance is based on the youth's participation and progress towards self-identified goals. So we use the a typical master service plan to identify what the youth is working towards and how we can support them in that. And then there's some intensive discussions with youth about what affordable and sustainable rental cost would be, and what an appropriate housing situation would be, as well as figuring in the other costs of living. Next slide. So some of our numbers: the number of youth that we permanently housed in 2014 was 39. The number of months a youth received subsidy was 5. Youth received subsidy anywhere from 1 month, just the move-in costs, and there was a few youth that did require up to 9 months of assistance. Only 1 youth received a formal eviction from their landlord in 2014, and this is what I've heard is kind of the primary concern in doing rental or rapid rehousing with youth, is that youth will end up with evictions on their record, and then that will be an additional barrier to finding housing in the future. That has not been our experience. Typically, we're able to intervene before a formal eviction is issued, either by supporting the youth or supporting the landlord. We do very frequent home visits and check-ins with the landlords to see if there's any concerns. We also negotiate lease lengths, and anywhere from a month-to-month contract to a 6-month lease to a 3-month lease, and are really able to partner with the landlords and the youth to make it a win-win for both parties. 1 year later, so youth that we housed in 2013, only 1 family had returned to homelessness, and these are numbers from our coordinated entry database. The average amount of rental assistance dollars spent per client was $2,869, and it ranged anywhere from $1,250, so that was the youth that just had the deposit in the first month's rent, up to $4,507 for 1 youth. Next slide. Some of the kind of distinguishing factors or unique elements to doing rapid rehousing with youth are that, we talk a lot about the definition of permanent, that youth may define this differently than older adults or families. Our programs do work with both single young people and young families. And we think about how often might a quote-unquote typical young person move in a year, and it probably is more than once. And so we recognize that for the young people that we serve too, and really want to negotiate a lease that's going to support that if their household changes, or if their income changes, and then they need to find a different, more appropriate unit. So that again is about that landlord partnership. The length of assistance is typically longer than the 3 months. 6 months, I would say, kind of anecdotally, is average. Typically not longer than 12 months. I don't think I've ever worked with a youth that received assistance for longer than 12 months. Some other things that you're going to see in working with youth doing rapid rehousing is the changes in employment, that they're still experimenting and exploring the job search and the job skills and career development, and that I think is a very normal developmental thing for a youth to be doing. Requires just ongoing conversation with them about how within that experimentation are they going to sustain their rent, as well as changes in household composition. So housing decisions based on a relationship or a partnership or a family that may change, and we just try to adapt and to be innovative with our youth in finding alternative housing or moving leases or switching units within a complex. And doing one or more requests for additional assistance is normal. Next slide. Some of the must-haves that really allow us to do this work with youth is that we have the ability to support youth with vocational programming. We have a vocational support staff in-house who meets with the client in addition to their housing case manager that can really kind of hone in on the specific strengths and barriers to maintaining housing. We can, if a youth is struggling to gain income, we also have some community partnerships where they can do paid internships and really get that experience and at least some source of income. We do intensive case management, including regular home visits, so we can really identify, what does it look like for this youth to be in their home, what is it looking like in that community, and any concerns that we see, we can really intervene on early. And then the ability to negotiate and support landlords quickly, and this is community-wide, just having the landlords that really trust us, that if there's something going on with a youth that's housed with them, that we can really support them and support the youth in a successful move. And then just advocacy on behalf of the young person who already probably is facing some housing discrimination. We get to do a lot of education for our community and for the landlords as far as sometimes basic landlord-tenant law, that just because a person is young, they can't actually discriminate against them in their rental, and just developing those relationships. Next slide. So this is a picture of our fair market rents for 2015. You can read through those. Obviously, they've increased over the last few years, and probably compared to many other places, larger cities in the country, they are low. Possibly compared to some rural areas, they're higher. We try to have very honest conversations with the youth about what they need as far as housing. So we would always, encourage them to kind of be pretty budget conscious, that, is a one-bedroom really necessary, or is a two-bedroom really necessary? What would it look like to have a roommate? We have a lot of shared living opportunities here, being in a college town. So we really do some thorough conversation with the youth about what they want in a housing situation, and try to connect them with that. Next slide. So that's a very brief overview of rapid rehousing for youth. I know there are probably lots of questions and what ifs, and I don't think there's any way we can ever get rid of all the what ifs. And I think in talking with Stuart before, somebody asked, how do you decide who gets this program? And we really allow the youth to choose it, and again, communicate that we believe they will be capable of doing this. There are times where we might not offer this to somebody if we have concerns or have seen past experiences where they have not been able to sustain it. But again, kind of going back to our values, we believe that youth have the capacity to change and have the capacity to develop these skills. And it's our job to help them get there. So thank you very much, everybody.
Great. Thank you, Robin. Thanks very much for that. And now, hopefully, we have Chris Freed. So, Chris,
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we sure can. Terrific.
Oh, awesome. I apologize. Good morning. Again, my name is Chris Freed. I work for LA Family Housing in Los Angeles, obviously California. Next slide. LA Family Housing has been operating for over 30 years and is recognized as a leader for our commitment and action toward ending homelessness in our community. Next slide. Just a little bit about who we are. I'll just be really, really brief. LA Family Housing is different from most of the partners in our community because we're recognized as not only a service provider but also as a real estate developer. We own and operate 3 shelters, 20 affordable permanent housing properties, including 2 permanent supportive housing buildings. Our most recent permanent supportive housing project, the Lewis, just opened a couple of months ago, houses 45 individuals and couples that don't necessarily have kids with a disabling condition. Next slide. In trying to follow best practices and methodologies, Los Angeles undertook a huge endeavor in 2011 with the piloting of the coordinated entry system for homeless families, which has now gone through several different name changes. As I'm sure everyone is aware, Los Angeles is often called the homeless capital, and our leadership recognized something had to be done. I believe that Los Angeles is now being recognized nationally for the incredible progress that's been made towards improving programs, collaborations, and creative use of funding. Our goal with the family system was simple: to reduce the number of unsheltered families and to quickly move families back into housing and reduce the stress and risk to kids. Next slide. So just some basic information and stats. In the first 18 months, our Family Solutions Center assessed 423 families, and we are just one of 8, as you saw from the previous slide. System-wide, we became really good at diverting families away from the homeless system by providing other resources and linkages that were more appropriate than utilizing the scarce shelter and housing resources that we had. We provided approximately 150 families with rental assistance. Some received just security deposit, others received between 1 and 3 months of rental assistance, and some needed more, like 9 to 12 months of assistance. But overall, the average was just about 5 months. Even though the rents are high in Los Angeles, we were able to develop relationships with landlords that made it easier to place families with multiple risk factors with little to no income at all. And you can see that from the slide itself. To date, we've had 12 of those families actually re-enter the system seeking more assistance that have been previously evicted. Next slide. So just a quick run through of how our services flow, as I'm sure many of you have similar programs in place. We start with a pre-screen to ensure that the families that are calling in are in fact homeless or at risk and in need of some type of an intervention. And then we meet with the family response team where the immediate needs are assessed and then connected to the most appropriate intervention to deal with the immediate crisis. Next, they move on to the housing case management component and the housing location piece where plans are devised and units are identified. And then once placed, they are handed over to the stabilization team where we ensure that the resource connections are followed up, like employment or benefits advocacy, where the need for rental assistance and how much is gauged, where landlord and tenant issues are addressed, and where the needs for further intervention and perhaps other more appropriate forms of housing are identified. And families are moved out if they are not successful in this particular intervention. Thank you. For moving to the next slide. So one of the questions that I know that comes up a lot with communities is, sorry about that, is looking at perhaps when you're moving to the rapid rehousing model, how do agencies budget for it? One of the things that LA Family Housing did was, or understood was that these types of programs can be subjective when you're trying to budget for the program, like how many families are you going to serve, how much assistance is each family going to get, what are the staffing needs, et cetera. What we have done is just, we looked at what the average rent was for the families that we were able to service for a 2-bedroom apartment in our community. And once we did that, we basically averaged everything else off of that particular number. And as you can see, that number for us in LA and some of the areas that we were moving families was about $1,250. So we would look at the RFPs that were coming out and the dollar amounts that were available for rental assistance, and then went with the average number of months of assistance that we deemed appropriate just based on experience, which gave us a pretty good idea of how many families we could assist and for what period of time, factoring in using the scaled rent method. We knew that not all the families were going to need a 2-bedroom or be able to even, in fact, afford a 2-bedroom. Several families that we've been working with, in fact, have elected to move into studio 1-bedrooms or even some of them into shared rent units based on affordability and long-term sustainability. This method has allowed us to be flexible in the way that we work with our families. Some of the families want bigger 3-bedroom units, some of them will need more than 4 or 5 months of assistance, and some will only use move-in funds, and that allows us to either extend people out or what have you based on the methodology that we've done when we budget for the program itself. Next slide. How do we then determine what each family gets? And this is where families and our staff really come together to determine what is the best housing option for the family. We don't do the budgets necessarily on what the current situation is, because as we know in rapid rehousing and housing first models, housing is first and then job or what have you. So we look at the potential for income. We work from there. And this case is a pretty good scenario of how we do it. Basically, we don't want to set people up for failure, because if we set them up for failure at the beginning, all we're doing is bringing them right back into the system in a relatively short amount of time. So we don't want to overhouse folks, but the reality is that many of our families without long-term subsidies, including Section 8, won't be able to afford rent in LA. Therefore, we really talk to the people about that this necessarily is not their final resting place forever, that this is just rather a step in their path. And as they increase their income, they'll be able to take the next step in their housing goals. But as you can see from this particular case scenario, this is how we would work with a family. We take, for example, a family of 5 that wants a 2-bedroom, but let's say one of the adults works at Target, they're part-time, they're getting some CalWorks, which is our welfare system in California, and being that the rent is $1,250, we worked with them back, or in this particular case it was $1,400. So we worked with them backwards from that. What were their bills, and then taking a look at that and determining that with this particular case that there was no way that this family was going to be able to afford the situation on their current situation. And then when we were talking to them about what was the likelihood of them increasing their income, the family said that this was all that they wanted to do, or this was what they were able to do based on their kids' age, et cetera. And so we had to be realistic with them in terms of finding a unit that was probably more appropriate for them. And in this case, a 2-bedroom was not going to work. Next slide. So then here comes the big looming question: what happens when? And I gave a number of different scenarios on this slide. The truth is that there's no one answer that will fit all. This is where the relationship with landlords is super important and where housing stabilization services are key. If you place folks and don't check in on them, on those that are more vulnerable, the likelihood of success is not high. My colleagues are very well aware, and follow up and follow through is the absolute essential key to ensuring success long term. When we see someone in a 2-bedroom who's failing to cut it, basically we'll check with the landlord to see if we can move the family to an open 1-bedroom unit if they have one available, if we can get them out of the lease or move them into another family, or move in another family member, or rent out a room. I mean, we just look at various different things that we can do to be able to assist the family in being able to sustain the unit long term. And of course, moving a family out for us is the absolute last resort, because obviously the things that we're going to be working with up front are going to be things like linkages to employment or benefits to increase their income. Next slide. And there's my contact information. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chris. And I'm switching slides now to get to Melanie's presentation. All right, now I'd like to now introduce Melanie Zamora. So Melanie, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So first of all, I love hearing Chris and Robin speak about some of these core components, because I think since 2009, since HPRP came about and rapid rehousing started to be established, I've heard of so many communities trying so many different methods, and I think we are finally getting to some real core components. And I love hearing that even with the youth, some of the same components are working with that population. And I think as a country, we're kind of coming around and figuring out how to do this. So it's exciting, and thanks for your presentations, Chris and Robin. So I work in Salt Lake City, Utah. You can switch to the next slide, Stuart, if you would. Just a brief overview, we have about 3 million people in Salt Lake County, or in Utah. The vast majority live right in my community in Salt Lake, the Salt Lake City area. We have about 1,000 families in our annualized point-in-time count. Our fair market rent is similar to Bellingham, and it's pretty low, I know, compared to some other communities. Our vacancy rate is about 2.7% right now. So we're pretty low. Our market gets really tight at times, and we have to really do some acrobatics with our landlords to figure out ways for them to keep working with us at such a high rate. Next slide. So before I just give this definition of progressive engagement, the Road Home, where I work, we are the largest shelter in the state of Utah, and we are the central housing agency for really any person who's homeless. We shelter about 1,000 men, women, and families with children every night. So we have targeted programs for veterans, especially veterans who are chronically homeless, special populations like elderly or some types of disabled individuals, chronically homeless individuals for sure, and then for families. So any homeless family living anywhere really, but the understanding in our community is that any homeless family in Salt Lake County can be referred to the Road Home and treated just like a family who's staying in one of our shelters for rapid rehousing purposes. So with all of that said, and that real centralized approach to helping people overcome homelessness, helping families overcome homelessness, we have to stick to our own core components, and our core is rapid rehousing and progressive engagement, and that's what I'll talk more about. But there are so many variables that surround those core components. So one of the variables, of course, is the money, and the money that we have available in our community to use for the families. And I think with any community, you have to take stock of what you have, what tools you have available, and you have to take stock again, and then you have to take stock again, and you have to continue to adapt all of those variables to the core components. So again, our basic core, and we're pretty die-hard tied to it. We have 5 years of data to show us that we think we're doing the right thing in serving families, but the core is to help families overcome homelessness as quickly as possible, despite whatever their barriers are, and then to provide financial assistance and really light touch case management, including some employment components, and then let the family help us determine what level of need they need after that initial period of rapid rehousing. So that's progressive engagement to us. Next slide, Stuart. So this is a variable, this first point. Almost every family is served with the same amount of assistance. During the HPRP years, the heyday of rapid rehousing, we had a lot of assistance. So we could kind of tie a nice bow around a good package of assistance and pretty much feel secure that we were going to be able to follow through on that commitment, that family. At that time, I think our month's worth of assistance was about 6 months, and that was pretty much planned on from the time the family was homeless. When I was talking to Stuart in preparation for this webinar, I was telling him that I feel like in Salt Lake County we're experiencing the backdraft of that heyday, and having so much HPRP money. ESG is such a tighter, smaller amount of money. TANF is our core financial resource, and there's just not ever enough money to give as much assistance as we want up front. So right now in Salt Lake County, our amount of assistance that we're awarding families in the beginning is a lot smaller than it was even just last year. It's a lot smaller. So the interesting thing, though, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself with the rates of success, is that so far we're still seeing a uniform percentage of families stabilizing outside of the sheltering system and not returning. So it's really interesting to us. It's a number we watch all the time. It's our biggest success indicator, is how many families return to shelter. And even, we've had all of these fluctuations in the amount of assistance given to a family in the beginning, and that rate has stayed very much consistent over the years. So our assumption, though, is that every family will be successful with no longer than 4 to 5 months of assistance. That said, about 10% of families that we serve are assisted with more months than that, and then those are the families that we're identifying for permanent supportive housing, like, and also shelter plus care vouchers and anything permanent that we have in our community. But even those families that are really intensive and we know they have lots of barriers to stabilization, we are still assisting them with rapid rehousing, and so many times those families are stabilizing just fine. That's another reason that we feel the progressive engagement is so important. Next slide. All right, so quickly, we assess every family for assistance and barriers while they're homeless. And again, they can be at any shelter, a domestic violence shelter, they can be anywhere. And we try to eliminate as many of those barriers as we can. We often pay off all utility debt, some types of eviction debts when we have the money to do it, anything that's really preventing that family from being placed that time. One thing that has really helped us, since we're using so many different funding sources and they change over time in order to continue serving the family as long as they need it, is that we consolidated our assessment materials. So we use TANF, we use ESG currently. We're also using home tenant-based rental assistance at the front end of rapid rehousing right now. So we consolidated all of those application materials and worked with our housing authorities to make sure that they were suitable consolidations and forms, and a family really only has to fill out one application packet. And then at the time, if we need to extend a family and we have to split their funding source to a different source, then we can just pull that initial packet back out, and the family can give us updated income verification or family composition stuff, but they don't have to go through the whole thing again. We want to make the financial assistance side as seamless as we can for the family so they can focus on other things like employment and getting their kids to school and that kind of thing. I think all of the presenters so far have talked about landlord work. It's so important that families rent with a landlord they're comfortable with. We have lots of housing specialists dragging families around to different places, meeting landlords, and touring apartments. We try really hard not to just assign a family to an apartment, which with a tight vacancy rate that can be even more challenging. But we want to set them up in a neighborhood they prefer and in a school district they prefer and all of that. Then we've discovered over time that families really want to know. We used to kind of say they don't need to know. At the beginning, they just need to get out of shelter, and then we'll work with whatever questions they have after they're out of shelter. But we really try to tell them, our funding is such that we only can commit to a couple months of assistance, and then they know that off the bat, and it helps them sort of plan their lives accordingly, I think. So we try to be really open with that. Next slide. I talked about this a little bit. Our base financial resource is TANF, and although we are so grateful to our TANF funders in our state, it's never enough. None of the money is ever enough to do this progressive engagement model perfectly. I think the progressive engagement model is very sound, and if we could have it funded well enough, it would be, to me, a model. It's just, it works the best, and philosophically, I think the families feel really good about it and work hard to help us determine their level of need. But it's not, right now, especially not funded enough. So we do things like we grab at any other funding source we have. We've used home tenant-based rental assistance for sort of the interim part of progressive engagement for a lot of years. So after the initial rapid rehousing phase, we'll have someone go to home tenant-based rental assistance funding, and we've just asked our funders if we could use that money for the rapid rehousing portion of the model, just to make sure that we're moving families out at the rate that they're coming in to shelter. So we do that all the time with any funding source that we can think of. Also in our community, we have very, very few transitional housing resources now. We've repurposed them at HUD's encouragement and because it seems to make sense, but also we naturally have felt that we don't have the need for real transitional housing anymore. We know we just want to move a family to the most permanent option that we have available. And then again, that 10% of families on this last bullet, the 10% of families that really struggle on rapid rehousing and in progressive engagement, those families are those that we help get onto the permanent supportive housing program. Next slide. Okay, I think here I just included some rates of success. And there's a typo here. It should be October 2009 to June 2014. So one interesting part of this slide is that even though we've offered the same amount of assistance, no matter what that amount was at the time, to every family that has presented for shelter or presented at one of our partner agencies for shelter, only half of the families have access this program, and we don't have other programs. This is it. So it's fascinating to us, and we try to explain why only half of the families have utilized the program. But it's a natural number, and it is consistent year after year when measured annually too. So we think that although we're offering the amount of assistance to everyone, that families often have their own plans when they come into shelter, and that's what we want to see. We want to see shelter and homelessness as a really temporary crisis, and I think that is a natural proof that is happening with families. All right, I think that's all I'll say, and of course I'm happy to answer any questions, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Melanie, and thank you to all the presenters. Just right now, a reminder that if you haven't done so already, please feel free to submit your questions. There's a raise your hand option, but we're actually not going to do that because we're going to try and go through all the questions that are asked and combine the ones that are similar. One thing I noticed, there's a lot, even though all three presenters come from different cities, different communities, different populations, there's still some themes that are threaded throughout. And as Melanie mentioned, talking to your landlords is really an important component. And even though that's really part of the first component of rapid rehousing, a lot of these core components are very fluid. So you'll see them sort of weave in and out. There's no real one hard and fast core components. They're really kind of weaving in and out. Another thing that came up was the braided funding, and I think that's really important to highlight, because it really, quite frankly, makes a difference between a single program and a systemic response. And when you're able to identify additional funding and a wide range of funding, you're able to take rapid rehousing to a much broader level. So right now I'd like to turn this over to Sharon McDonald here at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, who will be handling the Q&A portion. Sharon, go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Stuart, and I thought it was a fantastic presentation, so thank you for all of our speakers. So I think I have a couple of questions around the same frame that I think it might be useful to have everybody weigh in on, and that's essentially how to deal with things that are going wrong once the family's been housed. So if you after a family or a young person has been moved into the house, some of the basics aren't being attended to. Their utilities are cut off. They're not paying their utilities. They really aren't working whatever plan that you and they may have developed in place in order to pick up, in order to achieve the ability to pay their rent independently. They just don't seem to be moving things forward. Since the services are voluntary, what are some of the strategies each of you are using? And maybe we should just kind of start with the youth, and then have Chris and Melanie talk about the family side. Sure.
So if I'm understanding correctly, kind of what our strategy is if we are identifying that a youth isn't really attending to some of those needs Basics. Of independence. Okay. Yeah, I think obviously, like the other presenters talked about, it is so case by case that depending on the reason for why that's happening in that youth's life, would definitely inform our strategy. But to give some generals, I think our belief is that the youth wants to be self-reliant and wants to be successful in this program, and ultimately wants to be able to provide for themselves and for their family. And so, we really try to evaluate the why behind what's happening. Like if it's they're not paying their energy bill, their utility bill, our first questions are, do you check your mail? Have you been looking at have you been opening your mail? Do you understand the bill? And then, we'll try and help them re-budget some of that. But it's a lot of kind of mining for that information in their life and through that intensive case management. We also try to, for lack of a better term, not be insane. If we are trying the same thing over and over again and it's not working, we invite the youth into that conversation and say, like, what do we need to do differently? What do you need to do differently? And our approach is that if we see the youth trying different things, we'll continue to support them. That if they are really making that effort based on, the kind of those documents that I referred to earlier, that, we see that they're looking for work. We see that they're maybe addressing mental health concerns or chemical dependency concerns, and they're making progress towards those goals. We'll continue to explore that with them. There are times where we have to kind of present not an ultimatum, but just kind of the reality of the situation, that if something doesn't change, we may not be able to continue to support them and start looking at backup plans. In my experience, that's really rare that we have to get to that point, that there's a ton of opportunity in that information mining of asking the why. Why is this, why are you continuing to have all of your friends come stay with you? And there's often really logical reasons that give us room to move and grow and continue to work with the youth. So.
Okay, great. Chris, do you want to weigh in on the family side, or Melanie, or both?
Sure. I mean, I don't think that our strategy is necessarily that much different than Robin's. I think that a lot of it is looking at each individual family, trying to determine what's in the way. People have different things that are going on at different times, and I think Robin hit you know, the nail on the head when she said, do you even check your mail? Do you open your mail? A lot of people don't. They just, you know, they know it's a bill. Sometimes it scares them a little bit. They kind of throw it to the side. They leave it. They think it's, you know, some of these things are just a little bit overwhelming. I mean, we get plenty of folks that walk through the door that don't need a whole lot of guidance. But we get those ones that come in that they need more. And so it's just really staying on top of it. I think the biggest thing that we've learned over the time is that it, you know, is really the checking up and following through on the families. Obviously, we don't have enough time to do really intensive care with every family, which, you know, is why progressive case management, I think, is such an important component. But for sure, we have those families that we know from the beginning that need a little bit more checking up. And if we don't, then they tend not to come to us until they've already been evicted from court, and then there's not much we can do. So we definitely try to step in, work with them, connect them, make sure that the linkages are there. The stabilization component for us is probably the absolute most important for the families that are more vulnerable, because if not, I mean, the likelihood of return is great. So. Yeah, I don't think our strategies, again, are that much different from Robin's. I think it's just on a case-by-case and really looking at the situation and scenarios and trying to figure out what it is that we can do to assist them, or what is it that we can, where we can guide them so that they can assist themselves in gaining the skills to make sure that these things are paid. Or, you know, what is it that we need to do to really increase their income? So it's the same strategies, I think.
And Melanie,
this is
there anything? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so I would just add, you know, it's the same for us as the other presenters, but I would just add that we feel like it's really important to stay almost as close to the landlord as it is to stay to the client. So one thing that we've sort of naturally grown to do over time is our landlord negotiators, who are at the front end usually helping a family find a place, they continue to sort of case manage the landlord. So if things are going south with a family, or if they're, even if they're not, we encourage a monthly check-in, at least a monthly check-in with with every landlord, just to make sure, you know, subsidies are being paid, neighbor complaints are at a minimum, and that kind of thing. And we find that if we're really communicating with the landlord all the time, that we, you know, things that a participant might not be telling us, we find out about, and then we can sort of do this holistic crisis mitigation. So that's been a helpful tool for us.
Good. So I think all of this sort of speaks to an underlying concern that some providers who may be contemplating moving to rapid rehousing or making rapid rehousing a bigger part of their responses is sort of, well, to be concerned about what might happen, that people are not going to follow through and they may not succeed, or they may be resistant to succeed. And what I've heard from the three of you is actually, if there's something that looks like it's not working, they tend to be open to exploring it, and it's something worthy of exploration. It may not just be, aha, I'm in, they're never going to kick me out now, but there may be some kind of a roadblock, something's getting in the way, and there's a practical problem that needs to be solved and explored. Would that be sort of a accurate summation of what you think?
I think, this is Melanie, I think that's definitely true, and I tell people, you know, after we're in our 6th year of doing kind of a similar model now, and I tell people, families don't want to return to homelessness. They want to succeed. Families above, you know, many other populations, I think, they want their kids to be secure in a school. And, you know, of course there are outliers, but mostly families want to make this work. So if you go in as a supportive services mechanism, and you're like, let's make it work. What do you need us to do to help you make it work? And problem solve, and just stick with it, and stick with that idea, and not any type of consequential you know, tone to what your supportive services. I think families, you know, they perform beautifully most of the time.
Okay. So I'm I'm going to take advantage of me having the mic or the phone, as it were, and ask my own question. So I often encounter people who are looking for that sliver of the population that they serve being that may be appropriate or may do well with rapid rehousing. And I think that each of you well, in particular on the family side, I admit to knowing less on the youth side about the right role. But on the family side, we actually think it's probably the predominant and the best intervention for the majority of families. So, are there slivers which, instead of framing it as the families who can succeed with rapid rehousing, what are the families that you would be reluctant to provide rapid rehousing to, or do you find that a majority of families can succeed with rapid rehousing?
This is Chris Freed with LA Family. So we basically come from the angle that pretty much we give everybody a shot at rapid rehousing, because what we've learned, for the most part, not 100%, there are a few families that clearly present some very, very, very challenging barriers from the onset, and those families we will work with very quickly to connect to permanent supportive housing. But for the most part, and I would say 99%, we feel are rapid rehousing candidates, and then we work with them from that standpoint. And if things start to occur once they're in housing, then, and if we start to see some other challenges or barriers that may present during that time, where they're, and they haven't been successful, and I don't mean just one time, but a couple of different times, then we'll say, okay, we'll maybe this isn't the best intervention for them. But for the most part, and I think I actually had a conversation with Melanie, I think it was last year, where I had the same conversation. How many times do you put somebody through rapid rehousing, perhaps, when you see maybe it's just not the appropriate fit? But I definitely think that families will step up to the challenge, and they will surprise you time and time and time again. And so for us, pretty much most of the time, like I said, rapid rehousing is how we work with the families just from the onset.
And if I can chime in kind of about the youth perspective on that also, I would say I agree 100% with what Chris is saying, that, it is the majority of youth, I think, actually can be successful also in rapid rehousing, and I agree we also allow them to come through, once or twice, kind of some of those housing first experiences we know of, that it takes a couple of times for housing to stick. It can, with the caveat that I think with youth, one of the unique things is that we also, we use our transitional living program in, incredible ways. I think that still is a big need for the youth population, that some youth may still just be, mental health concerns may be just revealing themselves, or, chemical dependency concerns might be kind of at their height. So just, I think we have to have that menu of options for youth, really. But as far as youth being able to succeed in rapid rehousing, I think that it's the majority versus the sliver, like you said.
Okay. And let me just add one little thing. Well, it's a big thing. There will never be enough permanent supportive housing for everyone, to have them present and wish that you could give them housing forever and support them forever. Even if you think that family could benefit from it, they probably don't need it, and there's not enough. So if we're not doing rapid rehousing and progressive engagement, what else are we going to do? Nothing. They'll sit in shelter.
So the default of it sounds like of Los Angeles and the road home I'm long familiar with is really you rarely go to permanent supportive housing, and no longer in no longer transitional housing in Salt Lake City. First, you try rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing is once you know that rapid rehousing isn't going to succeed, and that's through multiple attempts. So that's kind of consistent with that progressive engagement approach. So I have a question that I'd like folks to weigh in on, and we have largely talked about two subsets of people experiencing homelessness: families with children and young adults, youth. What we haven't talked about, and what people are certainly interested in, is can any of you speak to providing rapid rehousing to single adults, and if possible, working with, if any of you know anything about this, working with people who are reentering the community, perhaps from a jail stay.
Mm-hmm. This is Melanie again. I don't mean to monopolize, but I'll tell you quickly about a little program that we've worked for a few years, and in the last year we've really kind of pinned it into the real rapid rehousing and progressive engagement model. But we took a cohort of people who were staying in shelter for a certain amount of time. So they didn't fall into the chronically homeless category yet, but had a lot of the same characteristics. So people who had been homeless for 150 days maybe, and we could document that. We helped that group of individuals. I think we've placed about 100 this year with ESG money, and just provided a 3 to 4 month term of assistance. And that program, it's showing slightly less rates of stabilization than families. Our family stabilization rate has been pretty consistently 86 or 87% over the years. This population is more in the lower 80 percentages, but it's working the same way. And when we see a very different population working in the same way, it makes us think that this is a best practice for any population. We started, now that our VASH resources for veterans are getting tighter. We had so many VASH vouchers for a long time. We didn't really have to prioritize, but now that they're getting tighter and we don't have enough for people who are chronically homeless, for everyone who's chronically homeless, we're starting to use SSVF first, and as kind of a rapid rehousing way to serve, and then the veterans who clearly need a VASH voucher, we're helping them with the VASH voucher. So we're putting both veterans and non-veterans into a rapid rehousing and progressive engagement model with variations from the families.
So I just wanted to just throw one thing on there. This is Chris again. So we also work with the individual population of all our agency and my colleagues very closely on that particular project. And one other thing to add on that, because I agree with what Melanie's saying. The rapid rehousing really works well for all the different populations. But one thing that we've been trying in LA is the shared housing, and particularly with individuals. And so we've had some success with individuals, particularly individuals with low income. Shared housing with a little bit of financial assistance, very, very short-term financial assistance, and it seems to be working really well. So that's it.
So just very quickly, just a quick follow-up. Does it look substantively different than what you would do with families? Do they need a different package of services? Is the rent, the length of the rent subsidy any different? Anything that people should know if they were setting this up for single adults that's different than what you do for families?
In Salt Lake City, we've set it up in a pretty similar way. For people who are the same type of person as a chronically homeless person, we're watching them differently as they use those first few months, but the package is the same. So I think we kind of can plan on someone needing a voucher, a long-term permanent supportive housing option more often than we can with families or than we would with families, but the package is the same.
if I can add in, so we do serve young people, but young adults. So, and a number of them end up being chronically homeless by the time they're 21, 22, 23. And so what I think the acknowledgement is just that the subsidy may be a little bit more in depth or longer, but the same approach is used, the same belief that they'll be able to be successful, or that connection with the shelter plus care or other permanent supportive housing options in the community. But I think the format is kind of the same, just this sort of understanding that it'll be a little bit more extensive subsidy.
Okay. So can I ask folks that have gotten non-traditional funds, the home funds, for example, or the TANF funds, or perhaps philanthropy dollars, to talk a little bit about that, how they managed to attract that investment in rapid rehousing, what they did, if they were the people behind the scenes working on trying to attract those resources to their homeless service system?
This is Melanie. So we have used home tenant-based rental assistance in Salt Lake County for about 13 years, and we used it in a 2-year transitional scattered site model. But when we started really getting into the rapid rehousing and progressive engagement model, we started thinking that was, why wouldn't we transition that 2-year subsidy program into part of the progressive engagement model, just the same as we were doing with every other funding source. So we went to our funders and talked to them, and of course talked to them about the success of the HPRP program, and they felt like it made sense. So that happened with home tenant-based rental assistance. TANF for us was a different sort of attraction. We dated TANF differently than we dated home tenant-based rental assistance, but we had a little pilot project with TANF money. That's really what made our TANF funders, our Department of Workforce Services, think that this could be a beneficial use of TANF money, and it's a long story. But very recently, we have made a deal with a local company that does lots of land development and property management and things like that. They have lots of money. Their office is at the very, very top of one of our tallest buildings in Salt Lake City. It's pretty amazing and intimidating to go there. But they decided that they wanted to give us private money just really as kind of tax write-offs. So their name's Wasatch Advantage, and they kind of got some of their friends together, and they just over the holiday gave us $200,000 to do tenant-based rental assistance and sort of a transition in place model for families. So we're just starting out with that, but that attraction couldn't have happened if we didn't have all of this other time under our belts, and we could talk about the success of those programs and things like that. So we're really excited to see how that private investment works. It's our first time to have private money.
Okay, I have to note that we've actually gone about 10 minutes over already. So if our presenters are willing to stay on for a little bit longer, I have a few more questions I'd like to ask, and then those who have questions in the queue, maybe we can follow up with you. If everybody agrees, I have a couple of questions about working with the landlords, and they've come through various ways. Like, if you're not providing a guarantee rent, how in the world do you get these folks willing to work with you? How do you, I think it was Melanie who talked a little bit about, almost providing case management to the landlord. How does that work? Are they interested in that? And how do you really get them interested in working with you? And I actually think it's an issue for all three of you. You all work in very different communities, and sometimes people, well, we know that people who have experienced homelessness aren't seen as the most reliable, perhaps, tenants by by risk-adverse landlords. So what works for you?
This is, so I'll go ahead and jump in here. This is something I actually think is really part of the fun part about this work is that we get to educate kind of a specific part of our community about homeless youth, you know, and so as far as the incentive for landlords, the way we often frame it is that we really provide a service for them that they don't have with their other tenants, in that they have somebody who can go in the home, whereas they can't, you know, they have to kind of go through their proceedings in order to do that. And we can check things out, and we can really have an eye on what's happening, and you know, that these tenants have access to all these other supports that their other tenants may not, and that, you know, they have the support of another agency. We talk about, you know, this portion of the rent according to the payment plan is it's not guaranteed, but it's essentially guaranteed for the length of that payment plan, that we really try to follow through with that as often as possible. You know, I think it's only been very rare occasions where we don't send payment, and we'll give them notice. But I think there's a lot of incentives for the landlords, that they have support and they know that that tenant has support, because it is time intensive and cost intensive for them to go through an eviction proceeding. And I think if a landlord has an out, they'll take it. So for us, that's worked really well.
In LA, similar experience. I think the fact that we can provide something that they would not get from just a regular renter, which is the ability to connect with somebody when things are going wrong. So much so sometimes that, you know, it can become a little bit overwhelming at times, but I think that the relationships that we maintain with those landlords continue to provide opportunities for the people that we have coming through our program. We've even got so far as to where we've brought in training to management companies about how to deal with certain groups. For example, we had a building, and this was a building that was primarily developed for single individuals, but they had some really large studios / one bedrooms, so they were looking for small families. And every issue they had in terms of if somebody came home and they were intoxicated, they would call us and say, well, what are we supposed to do? And we would ask them, well, what would you do with a regular tenant that came back that was intoxicated? So we had to bring in some training for them. We brought in, and locally we brought in, actually we brought CSH out to sit and meet with them and to provide training to some of the management companies, just simply to help them. But I mean, really at the end of the day, we can give a landlord something that a regular person that just applies to rent their unit cannot give, and that backup support, someone that can check in with the people, that can mitigate the issues, that can talk to them about having loud friends over, playing music too loud, their kids are running all over the place, those types of issues that they would not be able to get if, you know, from just an average person. And I think we've done a really good job of that. I'm pretty sure that most other communities would agree that when you work with a landlord to that extent, they start calling you and telling you when they have availabilities, and they no longer have to spend the money that they would, not only on the money that they would normally spend on advertising and things like that. They no longer necessarily need such a great population and such a need that we can almost always meet their need. And so it's a back and forth relationship that just seems to work really well.
Okay, and I'll remind everyone that actually around the landlord questions, for which we had quite a few, we have a webinar recording from December, the first of this series. This is really focused on the financial assistance and how do we figure out the money part, providing the rent assistance. And next month we're going to be really diving into the rapid rehousing services. Once people are in the house, how do we tailor the services and making sure that they have the stability and the resources that they need. I have one last clarifying question for Melanie, and then I'm going to turn it over to Stuart to close us, and that is, Melanie, I'm just going to read it. When you say families are in rapid rehousing an average of 110 days, what does that mean? Is that the amount of time you're providing financial assistance, or are the families able to become independent? Are they paying their own rent typically on an average of 110 days?
Yeah, so that's the that's the financial assistance portion. That is the true average of the 5 years that we measured with 110 days.
So I think there's something embedded in your answer there. Are you saying that the financial assistance and the case management rapid rehousing services aren't necessarily happening concurrently? Like you might provide rent longer than you're providing services, or services longer than you're providing financial assistance?
No, that's the whole package. So once the family's kind of graduated, that's the measurement time. So that's both financial and support.
Okay, so on average, at the 111th or 112th day, families are largely responsible for their own, on average, their own.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Well, great. This has been fascinating. Thank you all very much. And Stuart, can I turn it to you?
Yes. Thank you very much, Sharon. And thank you, everyone. I do want to thank our panelists for giving us such a great overview of this second core component, financial assistance, move-in, and rent assistance. For more information, you can always find our core components on our website. Here are links to those, the web addresses for those two documents. One is just simply the core components, the document that was actually agreed upon by our federal partners. And then the other one is Rapid Rehousing, a History and Core Components, which goes into a lot more detail about each of the different core components and a little bit of a background on Rapid Rehousing. And both of those are available on our website. I just do want to mention, as Sharon did, our upcoming webinar on February 10th is Core Components, the Rapid Rehousing Case Management and Services, which is the third and final core component. And then our conference is in San Diego, our National Conference on Ending Family and Youth Homelessness. We have just learned that our registration is closed, but there will be a lot of content that folks can find online, a lot of the presentations. So here's the contact information for the presenters today. And I want to thank you all for a wonderful presentation and for all the great questions. We didn't get to all of them, but if you have some specific questions, I'm sure the panelists would love to hear from you. So again, thank you to the panelists, and thank you for all the participants, and have a great afternoon.